Hey there, guys. With the Chilcot report due out in a few days, I thought it'd be fun to do a short video on impeaching Tony Blair. Now, this is quite a controversial topic, I know, but you might have heard about it in the news or even talked about it with your friends. I'm not going to make any judgment as to whether Tony Blair is guilty or innocent in relation to the Iraq War, but I thought it'd be fun to have a look at sort of the legal grounds for impeachment. What's the history behind it? Is it likely to happen? Is it likely to succeed? And also, if Tony Blair was found guilty, what sort of punishment would he be met with? Right, so let's get started. So when we think of impeachment, we would normally think of America, and in particular, the impeachment of Richard Nixon over the Watergate scandal and Bill Clinton in relation to, well, you can probably guess from the GIF there. Um, Now, both of these impeachments were unsuccessful. Richard Nixon resigned before he was impeached, and Bill Clinton served 2 full terms as president. But we'd normally associate it with a sitting president who's done something wrong, and they're then impeached by Congress. Now, in the UK, it's slightly different. While impeachment has traditionally been used to remove not prime ministers, but high ranking officials such as ministers from office, in theory, impeachment can be used against anyone in particular. So the fact that Tony Blair is no longer the prime minister doesn't really matter in this instance. In the same way that an impeachment could be made against you or I, an impeachment can also be made against Tony Blair. Now, impeachment was first used in 1376, but it was particularly popular in the 14th century before the Tudors came into power, and also again in the 17th and 18th century, particularly in relation to the Civil War. So I think in 1642 there were about a quarter of the total impeachments were made then in that single year. And also into the 18th century following the Glorious Revolution and the sort of impact of the Civil War over the longer term. Now, the most recent attempt was in 1806, and that was unsuccessful. So it's been a long time, really, sort of more than 200 years since an impeachment was even attempted on a politician. So what is the law for impeachment, given that it's so old, and where does it actually come from? Well, it's not in the legislation, and it's not even in the standing orders, which is kind of like the standard processes for Parliament. Instead, it comes from Erskine May, which is a book that was originally published in 1844. The first edition was published then, and has since become a part of the sort of UK's unwritten constitution. And this included the process for impeachment and sets out some of the details that would need to be followed. So, first instance, an MP, a single MP, doesn't need to be a group of MPs, it can be just one MP, makes an accusation against an individual, and they give evidence in support of that. Now, once that happens, the House of Commons votes on whether there are sufficient grounds for impeachment there. If they vote successfully in favour of that, there is a House of Commons committee that draws up what are called the Articles of Impeachment. Now, these articles would set out in detail the charges made against a particular individual and also produce evidence in that regard, kind of in a similar way to a criminal trial, where the prosecution would draw up evidence in order for an individual to be charged. The actual trial then is held in the other house, the House of Lords, and the Lords would act as sort of the judges in the case. And this is very similar again to a criminal trial that you would see in a Crown Court. So the House of Lords can summon witnesses, they could let Tony Blair go on bail, and they sort of have very similar powers. So it's not too dissimilar to what we would see in the normal criminal process. They would then vote and deliver a verdict, and that verdict is then returned to the House of Commons, who would then decide on a punishment, and they'd also have the option to pardon the individual. Now, there is an argument, obviously, considering that the last attempted impeachment was 1806, that this law is now obsolete. And this idea goes back to a 1967 parliamentary report that suggested that the whole idea of impeachment should be abolished. But this was never acted upon. And so technically impeachment still is on the book, so to speak, and could be used. Now, the idea that the reason why impeachment is seen to be obsolete is because whereas in the 14th century and later in the 17th and 18th century, the executive held a great degree of power. Now the courts and the parliament have a greater oversight of the executive. Now, this is a strong argument, but I think that in the case of Tony Blair, there's an argument that this is quite weak, really, because the executive, if we think about Tony Blair and also the cabinet, had a great deal of information and they didn't really share that with the House of Commons. And certainly the courts couldn't challenge the decision to go to war, and Parliament didn't really act on a full extent of information that arguably Tony Blair and the cabinet did have at that time. So if we're looking at impeachment as the executive branch wielding a kind of an unlimited degree of power, there's a good argument that impeachment should be used there. However, the argument against this was perhaps more recent. We'd have to look at Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which gives the right to a fair trial. And there's an argument that a trial held in the House of Commons and the House of Lords would be unfair, because not only would it impinge on the separation of powers, so the idea that the courts, the legislature, and the executive should all be separate, but there would also be accusations that this is essentially a political trial rather than a legal trial, and I think that there would be a strong argument for that. So looking at both sides of the argument, we can see that while there might be a case for using impeachment, there's questions as to whether that would be an infringement of Tony Blair's human rights. So let's say in a scenario where the House of Lords determines that Tony Blair is guilty and that verdict is returned to the House of Commons, well, what sort of punishment would be in place? Now, we're not in an era of public executions or anything like that, but it's certainly the case that Tony Blair could be sent to prison in theory by the House of Commons. This happened to Robert Walpole in the 18th century. He was sent to prison for a time and later he became Prime Minister and ended up impeaching other people. But the idea is that people can go to prison, and in fact, Robert Walpole was sent to the Tower of London for after his impeachment. So that's certainly an option. So interestingly, in 2004, there was a motion put forward to impeach Tony Blair using the method I've outlined. And this was supported by Boris Johnson, as well as Alex Salmond and a number of other MPs. Now, this was unsuccessful because it didn't have priority in terms of the parliamentary business. And when Tony Blair eventually resigned as Prime Minister anyway, the whole movement sort of dissipated. Now, as I mentioned, the Chilcot report is coming out in the next week or so, and there have been sort of mentions of Tony Blair being impeached and a new motion being started if the Chilcot report is quite damning against Tony Blair. In my opinion, I think that it's unlikely that any impeachment would really start, or certainly would struggle to get off the ground for the reasons that I've outlined. But who knows in this sort of crazy political world in which we live now. I mean, Wales are in the semi-final of the Euros, for goodness sake. So Gareth Bale will probably end up being Prime Minister by this time next week, for all I know. But I hope you've enjoyed this video anyway. If you did, make sure to leave it a like, subscribe for more law videos in the future, and I'd welcome any comments that you have below. Thanks again for watching. Bye!